The alarms on my ship screamed a warning I already knew was coming. 3 Imperial interceptors dropped out of the dark on our left flank, their weapons hot before their hailing signal even finished loading on my screen. My hands were steady on the controls, but my heart was not steady at all. Behind me, in the narrow corridor of my aging freighter, stood the 2 people I had spent 12 years protecting from exactly this moment. I am Daniel Ford, and I never planned to fly a human ship into the heart of an alien empire with 2 fugitive princesses hidden in my cargo hold. But plans have a way of falling apart when the people you love are running out of time. "They found us," said Vera, the older of the 2 girls, though calling her a girl felt wrong now. She was 23, sharp-eyed, and calmer under pressure than most soldiers I had served with. Her sister Lyra stood beside her, younger by 2 years, her jaw tight, but her hands steady on the doorframe. "They didn't find us," I said, keeping my voice level, even as another warning light flashed red across my console. "They were always going to find us. That was the plan." "Some plan," Lyra muttered. The lead interceptor's voice crackled through my comm, cold and formal, ordering us to power down and prepare to be boarded. I looked at the 2 young women who had grown up calling me family, who had learned to speak my language before they relearned their own, and I made a choice I had been circling for 12 years. "Let them board," I said. "It's time." 12 years earlier, I was a junior officer on a salvage vessel, pulling apart a wrecked slaver ship for anything worth selling. Most of what we found in those wrecks was scrap and sorrow. But in a sealed cargo container, behind a false wall, I found 2 children curled together in the dark, starved and silent, wearing rings on chains around their necks that no slaver would have left them if they had known what those rings meant. I did not know either, not at first. I only knew 2 kids needed food, water, and someone who was not going to sell them to the next buyer. My crew wanted to report the find to the authorities and collect a reward. I wanted to get the children somewhere safe first, and ask questions later. That disagreement ended with me leaving the crew, taking the children, and never looking back. It was Vera, barely 11 at the time, who finally told me who they were, weeks later, once she trusted me enough to speak. Their mother was the Empress of a vast alien dominion. Their father had died in a border conflict years before, and the wreck I pulled them from was not an accident. Someone in their mother's own court had arranged it, hoping 2 inconvenient heirs would simply disappear. I could have handed them over to the nearest Imperial outpost and let the system sort it out. I chose not to, because the men who arranged that wreck were still in power, still close to the throne, and I had no way of knowing who among the guards, ministers, or generals could be trusted. So I did the only thing that made sense to a stubborn, frightened young man with 2 children depending on him. I disappeared with them. For 12 years, we moved between human systems, keeping our heads down, changing names and ships more times than I could count. I taught them to fly, to fight, to read star charts, and they taught me pieces of a language and a culture I never expected to learn. We built something that did not look like a family on paper, but felt like one in every way that mattered. I always knew the day would come when hiding was no longer an option. That day arrived 3 weeks ago, when an old contact of mine, a retired intelligence officer named Colin Marsh, sent me a message that made my blood run cold. The Regency Council ruling in the Empress's name, the same men who had likely ordered that wreck 12 years earlier, were preparing a final move against her. Her health was failing, her guard was thinning, and with both her daughters presumed dead, there was nothing standing between the Regency and total control of the throne once she was gone. I sat with that message for 2 days before I told Vera and Lyra. I expected fear. Instead, I saw something harder settle into their faces, something that told me they had been waiting for this moment, longer than I realized. "We're not children anymore," Vera said. "We can't keep running while our mother is alone in that palace, surrounded by people who want her dead." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them it was too dangerous, that we did not know who to trust, that walking back into Imperial space was walking into a trap with no way out. But I looked at their faces and understood that I would be arguing against the exact thing I had raised them to become. So instead, I spent the next 3 weeks preparing everything I could, gathering every piece of evidence I had kept over the years, every medical record, every flight log, every photograph, anything that could prove who they were beyond a doubt. Which brought us to this moment, with 3 interceptors locked onto my ship and a boarding party on its way. The soldiers who came aboard were young, tense, and clearly not expecting what they found. They expected smugglers, maybe pirates, certainly not 2 women wearing the signet rings of a royal house presumed extinct. The lead soldier, a broad-shouldered man named Corin, stared at Vera's ring for a long moment before lowering his weapon. "Those rings can be stolen," he said, though his voice had lost most of its certainty. "They can," Vera agreed calmly. "Which is why I imagine you'll want to verify us properly rather than take my word for it. I assume the palace still keeps genetic records of the royal line." Corin looked at his commanding officer through the comm link on his wrist. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that told me someone on the other end was making a decision far above his pay grade. Finally, the order came through. We were to be escorted, not detained, directly to the capital. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The flight to the capital took 6 hours, and I spent most of it going over contingency plans with Vera and Lyra, trying to anticipate every way this could go wrong. Lyra, ever practical, kept asking the harder questions. What if she doesn't believe us? She asked at one point, staring out at the passing stars. "She will," I said, though I was not entirely certain myself. "What if she does believe us, and it doesn't matter? What if the Regency controls enough of the court that none of this changes anything?" I did not have a good answer for that one. All I could offer was the truth. Then we make sure it matters. We didn't come this far to walk away quietly. The capital city rose ahead of us like something built to be looked at from a great distance and admired, not lived in up close. Towers of pale stone stretched toward a sky striped with orbital rings, and the palace at its center looked less like a home and more like a fortress, dressed up in ceremonial robes. I had seen pictures of it before, but nothing prepared me for the way it felt cold even from orbit, like a place that had forgotten how to be warm. We were brought down through a private landing corridor, away from public view, which told me the Regency was already trying to control how this story would be told before it even began. Guards lined the halls as we walked, their expressions unreadable, their loyalties unknown. I stayed close to Vera and Lyra, aware of how out of place I looked among them, a human in worn traveling clothes surrounded by centuries of alien tradition I barely understood. The throne room, when we reached it, was nearly empty. I had expected crowds, ceremony, spectacle. Instead, I found a handful of ministers standing stiffly near the walls, and at the center of the room, seated on a throne too large for the frail figure occupying it, sat the Empress. She looked nothing like the portraits I had seen. Those images showed a woman radiant with authority. The woman in front of me looked worn thin by grief, her eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with loss carried too long. When her gaze fell on Vera and Lyra, I watched something flicker across her face, hope fighting against years of hardened disbelief. "You will forgive me," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the tremor I could see in her hands, "if I do not simply accept what my eyes are telling me. I have been shown false hope before." Vera stepped forward, unafraid, and I felt a swell of pride so sharp it almost hurt. "Mother," she said, using a word I had rarely heard her speak aloud, "you used to call me your storm cloud, because I never let anything go quietly, not even as a child. You called Lyra your quiet flame, because she burned slower, but longer than anyone expected. No one else knows those names. No one else could." The Empress's composure broke for just a moment, her breath catching, her hand rising to cover her mouth. For 12 years I had wondered what this moment would look like, and nothing I imagined came close to the raw silence that filled that throne room as a mother looked at daughters she believed she had buried long ago. "It cannot be," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction behind the words, only desperate hope, trying to protect itself from disappointment. "It can," Lyra said gently, stepping up beside her sister. "It is." The Empress rose from her throne on unsteady legs, and for a moment I thought she might fall, but she crossed the distance between them with a strength I would not have expected from someone so worn down by years of grief. When she reached them, she did not embrace them the way I expected. Instead, she took their faces in her hands, one at a time, studying them as though memorizing details she was terrified of losing again. "My girls," she finally said, and the room, which had been holding its breath, seemed to exhale all at once. It was in that fragile, unguarded moment that the Empress turned to me for the first time, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the human standing awkwardly near the doorway. "And you," she said, "who are you, to bring my daughters home after all this time?" I felt every eye in the room shift to me, and for a moment, I did not know what to say. I had rehearsed explanations during the flight, careful diplomatic phrases meant to soften 12 years of hiding her children from her. Standing there, under her gaze, all of that preparation fell away. "My name is Daniel Ford," I said simply. "I found your daughters 12 years ago, in the wreck of a ship that was never supposed to have survivors. I did not know who they were at first. I only knew they needed someone to keep them safe, and no one else was offering. So I did." "You kept them from me," she said, and though her voice was not cruel, the accusation still landed heavy in my chest. "I did," I admitted, "because I did not know who around you could be trusted, and I was not willing to gamble their lives to find out. I am not asking you to forgive that choice. I am only telling you why I made it." The Empress studied me for a long moment, long enough that I felt the weight of every possible outcome pressing down on the silence between us. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "You raised them. They raised themselves mostly," I said honestly. "I just tried not to get in the way." For the first time since we had entered the room, something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth. That fragile peace did not last long. Before the day could settle into anything resembling calm, the doors to the throne room opened again, and 3 members of the Regency Council swept in, their robes immaculate, their expressions carefully composed into masks of concern that did not reach their eyes. Their leader, a tall minister named Halden, wasted no time. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing just enough to satisfy protocol, "we came as soon as we heard the rumors. Surely you understand the danger of accepting unverified claims, especially from strangers, arriving on an unregistered human vessel." "They are not strangers," the Empress said, but I could hear the old political caution creeping back into her voice, the caution of a ruler who had survived this long by trusting almost no one. "With respect," Halden continued smoothly, "the royal children died 12 years ago. We hold death certificates confirmed by 3 separate inquiries. What stands before you now could be an elaborate deception, orchestrated by outside forces, seeking to destabilize the throne during a moment of vulnerability." I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and immediate, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was exactly the confrontation I had prepared for, the reason I had spent 3 weeks gathering every piece of proof I could find. "I have documentation," I said, stepping forward before anyone could stop me. "Medical records taken over 12 years, comparing genetic markers to imperial archives your own ministry maintains. Flight logs showing our movements since the day I found them, and testimony, recorded and dated, describing details of the wreck that were never made public, details only someone present that day could know." Halden's composure flickered, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "Records can be falsified," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "They can," I agreed, which is why I brought copies to 3 independent archivists on the journey here, all of whom confirmed the same findings before we ever entered Imperial space. "I did not come here hoping you would simply take my word for it, Minister. I came prepared for exactly this moment." The room had gone very quiet. I could see the other ministers along the walls exchanging uncertain glances, watching to see which way the political wind was about to shift. It was Vera who spoke next, and when she did, every trace of the frightened child I had once found hiding in a cargo container was gone, replaced by someone who had clearly spent years imagining this exact confrontation. "You called 3 inquiries confirming our deaths," she said, stepping toward Halden without hesitation. "I would be very interested to know who conducted those inquiries, Minister, and whether any of them ever actually recovered our bodies, or simply accepted the word of the very people who arranged the wreck in the first place." Halden's face went pale. "That is a serious accusation," he said carefully. "It is," Vera agreed, "and I intend to make it publicly, with evidence, unless you would prefer to explain to my mother right now exactly how 3 separate inquiries, managed to confirm the deaths of 2 children, whose bodies were never found. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. Halden opened his mouth, closed it, and looked toward the Empress as though hoping she might rescue him from the moment. She did not. "Answer her," the Empress said quietly, and there was nothing fragile in her voice now. Halden had no answer that did not incriminate him further, and everyone in that room knew it. I watched years of careful political maneuvering collapse in the space of a few sentences, watched a man who had helped orchestrate the disappearance of 2 children finally run out of places to hide. The Empress rose to her feet, and though her body was frail, her presence filled the room in a way it had not since we arrived. "I have listened to enough," she said. "My daughters have returned to me, proven beyond reasonable doubt by evidence this council cannot refute. From this moment, they are restored to their rightful place as heirs to this throne. Any minister who wishes to challenge that decision may do so openly, in front of the full court, rather than through inquiries conducted in shadows 12 years ago." Halden did not challenge her. Neither did the other ministers standing near him, their earlier confidence gone entirely. Within hours, word had spread through the palace and beyond it, and whatever support the Regency had quietly built over the years evaporated the moment the truth became public. By nightfall, the guards loyal to Halden and his allies had been quietly relieved of duty, and the ministers themselves were taken into custody without a single shot fired, their coup collapsing, not through violence, but through the simple, undeniable weight of the truth finally being spoken aloud. Later that evening, once the palace had settled into something resembling calm, the Empress found me alone on a balcony overlooking the city, watching the lights flicker on across towers I still did not fully understand. "You could have handed them to the Empire years ago," she said, joining me at the railing. "It would have been simpler." "Simpler isn't always safer," I said. I didn't trust the people around them enough to take that risk. "You were right not to," she admitted, and I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like gratitude, though I suspected admitting that cost her something. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay. You raised my daughters when I could not. You kept them alive when the people meant to protect them tried to erase them instead." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know," she said. "Which is precisely why I intend to offer you one anyway." She offered me titles that night. Land, positions within the new court her daughters would help rebuild. I turned all of it down, not because I did not appreciate the gesture, but because none of it was ever what I wanted. I did not raise Vera and Lyra hoping for a place among nobility. I raised them because they needed someone, and I was the person standing there when it mattered. What I accepted instead was smaller, and far more valuable to me, a standing invitation to return, whenever I wanted, for however long I wanted. A promise from both daughters that my ship would always have a place in whatever fleet they eventually commanded, and something Lyra insisted on before I left the palace grounds that night, something that meant more to me than any title ever could. "You're still family," she said, "whether you accept the crown's gratitude or not. That doesn't change just because we're home now." I flew back into the dark that night with an empty cargo hold and a lighter heart than I had carried in 12 years. I had set out long ago to save 2 frightened children from a fate no one deserved, never imagining where that choice would eventually lead. I did not save an empire because I set out to be a hero. I saved it because 2 kids needed someone in their corner, and somewhere along the way, that simple choice became the only thing standing between an empire and its own destruction. Some debts, I have learned, are not repaid in titles or land. They are repaid in the quiet, lasting truth that family, once chosen, does not stop being family just because the stars in between finally close the distance.